Howdy and welcome to another episode of Baking with the Beard. Different day, different hat, forgotten my thingy. Be right back. Much better. Can't do baking without my thingy. Right, today, feed number 2 for your starter. Little Juno. She's been sat up on her shelf since we last played with her 24 hours ago. She's starting to get these nice little tiny bubbles form in the surface. Let me show you this. This is what you want. This is a good sign. These little tiny bubbles, hopefully you can see them, they are an indicator that all that activity we've been speaking about, all that natural yeast is fermenting together inside of the starter. By the time we come to use this starter in our bread making, we'll see a lot more bubbles than that. If you're not seeing any bubbles yet, pop me a note, send me a picture, and it's probably to do with taking a bit of time to get the right temperature. Maybe the flour you've got is a little bit older, so it's not quite as active. There's lots of different things that can contribute to it. But after 3, 4, 5 days, you should start to see the bubbles. My bubbles are already here after 2 days. That's a good indicator that I've got it absolutely spot on in terms of my ratios, in terms of where I'm storing it overnight. Well done, me. Right, so the 2 things we're going to cover today. We're going to do another feeding, and then we're going to talk about what steps come next, what you need to prepare to turn this into a cracking loaf of bread. First and foremost, let's feed Juno, because she's hungry. So, exactly the same goals as we had yesterday when we did the feeding. We're looking to discard half of what's in there, so we're going to discard about 100 grams, and we're going to replace that with 100 fresh grams, evenly split between flour and water. The scales are set up with a receptacle so I know I've taken out the right amount. Sometimes it's easy just to pour. There we go. Lovely jubbly. Let's see if I can get it in front of the camera so you can see it a bit better. Just giving him a nice little pour out. There's 16 grams. And that's my 100. So, we've discarded half. Now at this stage, I can hear you thinking, that's a bit of a waste. And you're right, it is a bit of a waste at this stage. After a few more days, when your starter is more active, you can do things with the portion that you're discarding every day. You can turn it into pancakes, you can turn it into savoury dishes. It's actually how you start the process of making bread. You pull half out and you go and store the rest. So in future, you don't have to let this go to waste, but for the first few days, it's best just to throw that away. That's not really much use for anything yet. There you go over there. Now, if you recall, on the first day, I put an even split of white and wholemeal flour in there. On the second day, I put just white. Today, I'm going to flip back to doing the even split again of white and wholemeal. I like to mix it up, and I think it makes a better, more active starter to mix it up. If at home you've only managed to find plain flour, just keep doing your plain flour. 50 grams of plain flour, 50 grams of water. That'll be absolutely fine. Remember, the task I set you at the beginning of this process is to try and find some bread flour before we come to baking. It makes a big old difference, so keep hunting around. In fact, I'd even say, if you can't find any bread flour yet, we'll wait until you've got bread flour before you do your first bake. So, feeding. 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water. Easy. I'm going to start with my wholemeal. I'm going to add in 25 grams of wholemeal. That's a tiny bit over. Doesn't matter so much, I'll use just a little bit less of the one. That was 28, not 25. 50 total grams of flour in the top. 50 grams of fresh water. Boom. I've now added 100 grams of fresh ingredients to the starter. Go do the usual mix it up. That's next. Get out of it. Remember, the aim of mixing it is so there's no dry bits when you're looking at it. Right, that's all mixed in. Now, as I did on the first day, I'm going to add in a splash more water, just a dribble more. The reason I'm doing that is because, again, today, just like the first day, I'm using wholemeal, and the wholemeal is a little bit more absorbent, it's a bit more water hungry, so I just add an extra dash to make sure it's not too thick. I'm looking at this here, and it's come out just a little bit thicker than I want it. So I'm just going to give it a little extra splash. If in doubt, for you at home, a little extra splash will not hurt it. There we are. You don't want the thing swimming in it. But again, you don't want it too thick that it looks like you could stand the spoon up in it, like a thick northern gravy. You don't want that. Lovely, jubbly. There we go. That's what I'm after. That's what I'm after. Runs off the spoon, like that. Cool. That's Juno fed. Ready for tomorrow. Let's pop him away, and then we'll go. Let's pop her away. And then we'll go through the next steps and what we need to prepare to actually bake. So, end of day 3. You've created your starter on day 1. You've fed him for the first time on day 2. You've fed him for the second time on day 3. The plan now is to feed him again tomorrow and assess if he's ready for baking and if you're ready for baking. We'll have another top-down look tomorrow and see what we're like in terms of bubbles. See if our bubble count has increased. And if it has, we're going to start to get ready to do our first bake. I said it a bunch of times, I'll say it again. If you can hunt down some bread flour, it's kind of necessary to do the next step. So go and find some. Go and rob someone, go and borrow some from somebody. Don't interact with other people. Go and find some bread flour. If you haven't got any bread flour yet, but you think you might be able to get some in the next 3 or 4 days, just wait. We'll just keep on feeding your starter, and you wait until you've got that bread flour to do your first bake. If you're lucky enough to have some bread flour knocking around, the process that we're going to follow is basically this. The day before we want to bake, we feed our starter twice. So we'll feed him once in the morning and once in the evening, so he's super active, ready for the next day. We'll then, this is the discard from earlier on, we'll then siphon off half, and this is the half we will bake with. The main starter we'll feed, pop the lid back on, and tuck him away again. He's then ready for the next bake. And the half we've siphoned off, we're going to go and blend with the bread flour. We then let it take most of that day, the first day, to mature and to turn into a nice pliable dough. Throughout the course of that day, you'll revisit it 3 or 4 times and fold it and do a few things to it that I'll walk you through. At the end of that day, what you'll end up with is a nice round ball of dough that we're going to put in the fridge overnight to expand a little bit, and we actually bake him the next morning. So it kind of takes that like about a 30-hour process to really turn it from starter into bread. But during that time, you don't need a lot of contact hours. You don't need to be constantly looking at it. You'll just revisit it every hour or 2, do a few tweaks, and then come back in a while. Timing is the key thing when it comes to bread. Timing in terms of understanding when your starter's ready to actually bake, and then the timing of how you go through that process on bake day. We're going to go through it step by step, but what you need to think about is preparing yourself for that, and to make sure that on the day you choose to bake, you're going to be around the house for a little bit in the morning, a little bit around lunchtime, a little bit in the evening, ready to bake the next morning. I'll draw up a little schedule of how it actually looks once we go through it. It's not too confusing, but what you can't do is prepare it in the morning and then go out for the next 12 hours and come home again expecting it to be ready. It does take a little bit of care throughout the day. So you pick your bake day based on when you know you're going to have the time. Luckily for most of us, we're trapped indoors, so that time's going to be on hand. But still something worth thinking about. The other things you're going to need when it comes to bake day is some salt, the flour, as we discussed many times, bread flour. Crossing my fingers for you that you can find some. you're going to need a relatively deep round bowl, both to mix in and then a second bowl for it to go in the fridge in overnight. I'll give you an example. I mix in something like this. Oh, I can sound that. I mix in something like this, you know, a mixing bowl. That's where he spends most of his day. And then when I put him in the fridge, he goes in the fridge in one of these. This is called a banneton. Now, you're not going to have one of these lying around. If you do, use it. For the first 10 bakes, I didn't use this. I used this. This is a standard ceramic serving bowl that I think we'd use for salad or some such if we were entertaining. I use this lined with a tea cloth. Has exactly the same effect, and that is perfect for starting off in. So, a bowl to mix in, a bowl for him to go to sleep in the fridge overnight, and the last thing, how you're going to cook him. Ideally, you've got one of these, or something like this. This is a big old casserole dish. Listen to that sound, that's great. Ideally, like I say, you pop your loaf in there, and this sealed heavy metal pot creates a bit of steam in there and allows him to rise inside this safe environment. It's called the Dutch oven effect. If you don't have one of these, that's not a problem. But if you can find something like this lying around at home, that would be great. I got this after probably about 10 or 15 bakes. Before that, I used a much smaller version that I had. It's just an old casserole dish. It's not nearly as big, but I made it work. Before that, I just did it free-form in the oven, which we can do, and we'll cover that off. And if it goes sideways, if you've got an old loaf tin knocking around, if at any point you find your dough isn't doing what you want it to do, or it's not quite shaping up how we want it, we stick it in one of those, throw it in the oven, we cook it up, and it'll still be perfectly edible. It just won't look as ornate as perhaps you had in your mind when you started. So this is your kind of backup. The final thing it's worth finding for baking day, some greaseproof paper. Simple as that. Most of you are going to have all these things knocking around at home. If you don't, I will suggest a substitute for each one as we go through the stage. If you don't have any greaseproof paper and the local shops are out, we can find something else. This is only really to make your life easier, it's not a necessity. Right, with that in mind, today we fed our starter for the second time. We've started to think about what we're going to need to do to be ready to bake. That's it for today. We'll see you in the next one when we're going to feed him again, feed her again, and get properly ready to bake. Hopefully you've got lots of nice bubbles coming along. I'll see you there.